Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here.
And I'll be your moderator for this debate to talk about trade and investment between Brazil and Africa. We have an absolutely amazing team. I'm going to call on stage Mr. Elias Kagumia, the Group Chief Risk Officer of the African Export-Import Bank. Please, sir. Mr. Zemedene Negatu, Global Chairman of Fairfax African Fund. As you wish. Mr. Paulo Gomes, CIO of Orango Group Investment Cooperation. And Miguel Azevedo, Chairman of the Investment Banking for Middle East and Africa at Citi. So before I ask you all questions here, and obviously I'm going to open the floor to all of you, allow me to put this debate into a global perspective. The WTO is stalled. The world is fractured. Protectionism by the large economic powerhouses is evident. As we just heard from Ambassador Amorim, the situation is dire. At the same time, it is very interesting to hear President Lula, some months ago, complaining that our region in South America was not as integrated as Africa is in at least some aspects. He insisted that instead of trying to copy the European model of integration, perhaps South America or Latin America should look towards the African example. And indeed, the African Continental Free Trade Area represents a significant development in Africa. Its aim is really ambitious, to create a single market and facilitate movement of people, services, and capital. Once implemented, it will be the largest regional trade area with projected population of 1.3 billion people and a combined GDP of $7 trillion by 2035. So allow me to ask the four of you the same question so we can start this debate. How will this project help cement regional integration, enhance connectivity, and harmonize rules in Africa? Who wants to start? Elias.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank Professor Monti for inviting us. I'm from the African Export-Import Bank. Unfortunately, my president, Professor Rama, couldn't make it here. It's a long way from Cairo to Sao Paulo, but we value the relationship. We value the vision behind this forum, and that's why we are here. Now, I think in answering your question, it's important to recognize that on the African continent, we had regional trading economic blocks. So we have the COMESA, we still have the SADC, we have the ECOWAS, we have the WAMSI, we have the East African Community. The reason why we think the AFCFTA is a bit different is because of the lessons that the African leaders drew from what is already existing. You need to have an agreement, and I think it's important, and we congratulate all the leaders for having come up with a good agreement. But you need political will behind that agreement. 54 of the 55 countries on the continent have already signed the agreement. I think it's only Eritrea that is yet to sign. 47 out of the 54 have ratified the agreement into law. Only 7 are yet to, and some of the countries, Sudan, South Sudan, Libya, we know the challenges they are facing. So there is goodwill, and we have an agreement. But beyond that, you need infrastructure to facilitate the agreement in terms of its implementation. You need a bank, because trade is financial in nature. And the African Export-Import Bank is behind that. You need to facilitate payments, right? Because you're talking about trade. How are people going to facilitate payments? And the African Export-Import Bank has put in place what they call the Pan-African Payments Platform to enable payment in local currency between countries on the continent. But also, you need the right infrastructure in place in terms of transport, in terms of transit. Today, most of the African countries, as you know, are landlocked. To move a container from one end to another, you have to go through multitude of countries, and you need bonds from border to border. So the African Export-Import Bank has put in place a 1 billion transit guarantee to facilitate safe movement of goods across borders. So we see that platform as an opportunity to develop regional value chains, regional supply chains, because we also learned from what happened from COVID, from Russia, Ukraine, with food inflation, energy crisis, etc., etc. So if we can bring that production of grain locally, if we can manufacture locally, it would mean that we will cushion ourselves from external shocks. I think I will stop on that from now.
Mr. Negato.
All right. Well, thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. And thank you, Joao, and for inviting me here. It's always a pleasure to be back in Sao Paulo. I used to live here more than 20 years ago. We did a lot of investment deals in Brazil. So any excuse to bring me back to Brazil, I'm here. So to answer your question, I'll give you an example. By way of introduction, I'm the chairman of a Washington, D.C.-based private equity firm, an investment bank. Although we're based in the United States, most of our business is in sub-Saharan Africa. So we deploy global capital in Africa. And then on the investment banking side, investment banking advisory side of it, we raise capital, we do mergers and acquisitions, and many other things. So I'll give you the perspective of an investor doing business in Africa to answer your question. So when we look at, for example, we do manufacturing in Africa. At the moment, almost all of our exports go to Europe and eventually to the United States. But with the opening up of the Africa Continental Free Trade, it's right there in Africa that we can export what we're now sending to Europe. That's a very practical example of the benefit of having a Pan-African free trade area. As you said, the world's largest free trade area. So for us, AFCFTA, unlike what we have now. Today we have a spaghetti maze of regional trading blocs. We have in the West Africa, ECOWAS, in East Africa, EAC, in Southern Africa, SADC. But the fact of the matter is a lot of these economies as standalones are actually very small. So if I'm going to bring in a large manufacturing investment into Africa, I don't just look at that country alone. I look at the region, the neighboring countries, but ultimately I look at the whole of Africa. That means I can de-risk my risk. If there are some issues in a particular country, I know I'm doing business in multiple other African countries. So the opening up of trade in Africa with borderless, I know it's an aspirational thing, it's just getting started, but imagine 5-10 years from now when those borders actually don't exist. When I was actually yesterday reading an article, the president of Kenya said starting very soon, Africans would not need visas to come to Kenya. So imagine if we eliminate that. So me, for example, as an American traveling into Africa, I'm fortunate I don't need a visa almost anywhere in Africa, but an African today going to another African country needs a visa. That's the oddity of what we have now. So when you have these borderless environments, efficiencies goes up, the cost of doing business comes down, and therefore there will be a lot more FDI, whether from here, from Brazil, or from any other places. So it's a massive transformational opportunity, both for Brazilians who do business in Africa, and also others coming into Africa. So we need to look at it differently than what we've seen in the past. As I said, we raise capital around the world. We have an office in the United States, but we also have an office in the UAE, in Dubai. We also have an office in Africa. So now we can more confidently deploy our resources, the capital, when there's a borderless Africa. And final point, one of the attractions for us and other investors about Africa is increasingly becoming urban, increasingly becoming young. Actually, it's already very young, but increasingly is becoming integrated. Those three elements are becoming extremely attractive for investors. And I want to urge, I have a lot of Brazilian friends here in the room as well in Brazil, to start looking at Africa in a different way when they want to do business in Africa. And then maybe later on we can enlighten on some of these things. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Paulo Gomes.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think I will join my colleagues to thank João for every year stubbornly bringing all of us to Brazil. I'm from Guinea-Bissau, so I will speak in English, will not speak in Portuguese, not to impose the language here. But this is, I think, a process that you have started that we need to consolidate. It's 10 years, we need more, of bringing more Africans to Brazil, but also more Brazilians to Africa. By the way, talking about my own country, we have also relations that are driven by culture. Today in Guinea-Bissau, you can have, in one of the small museums, you can have the exact name of the ship that came with slave here in Brazil. So you have that relationship for the long term. Today, I think, from what I was told, 50% of Brazilians probably have African blood. We know that in 40 years, 50 years, maybe 3/4 of the Brazilian will have African blood because people get and mix to each other. So our culture will be very important in influencing the future of Brazil. And this is an opportunity for us to build that bridge and make it a huge opportunity for culture, for economy, for finance, but also influence, because it's the world that's going to continue to be divided, and I think we need to have a front on how to build a better world for all of us. I think the good news we had on some of the discussion this morning, and my brother, I think from Uganda, from Africa Exim Bank, was talking about, the Continental Free Trade Agreement is also about erasing the borders that was built artificially, designed artificially. And our founding fathers did a wonderful job, greatly led by Ethiopia, in saying we're not going to touch the borders that we have inherited from the colonial system. This is a major achievement. People don't think about it. Imagine if African continent, African countries, the 50-something, would have spent the time fighting each other because of borders. We know in building nation, this issue of war and extending your area of influence was a major impediment. We don't have it, but we shouldn't take it for granted. Now only trade will help us erase those borders. And so in the past, the whole agenda of the trade was essentially driven by regional institution, political institution. You need the political commitment, but you didn't have really cooperation to help accelerate those internal trade. So my company with my colleague, we have been focusing on how to help create companies that could be multinationals in Africa. So they could go from country A to country B to make money. I think the ambassador Almorin and minister was talking earlier about the transportation between countries, between Brazil and Africa. Ethiopian Airlines is doing a wonderful job in connecting African countries, but I think they fly to Sao Paulo, I think twice, 3 or 4 times a week. We need to do more, and this is what Ethiopian Airlines and Liz was working quite on that, to make sure that you have more connection between African countries. And one of the major companies that is really working on that is Ethiopian Airlines. But you have also companies that are working now to facilitate the transit of goods and services between African countries. There's a company based in Côte d'Ivoire called Scanning System. Their model is to manage what we call the joint border posts between countries. And now they are managing close to 6, which means that a truck will arrive, and you know, if you have traveled to Africa, you will sometimes will take a week for a truck to cross a border. Now, with the business model they have put in place, a truck will arrive, all the information will be sent prior to when they arrive at the borders between the two countries. It takes them 1 day or less. So this has been now multiplied. Last week we were with this company, that we have also some participation in that company, in what they call the Walvis Bay Corridor, because Namibia is becoming now a major entry point for countries in the center, in Southern Africa, such as Botswana, Zambia, I think Botswana, Zambia, and even DRC. Apart from what's happening now with the Lobito corridor, you have also Walvis Bay will be a major entry point. And these countries have more or less agreed to have joint border control, so goods and service will happen. So I think we need to continue to push for regional entities. You talk about payment, you talk about having a bank, and Afrexim Bank is playing that important role. I think now we need to make sure that the secretariat of the CFTA is staffed with support and resources, because there will be some losers and some countries will gain in this, let's be frank. So we have to make sure that the countries that are losing will receive also some sort of compensation to have them. And finally, I think we need to deal with this value chain. Africa is in the left side of the value chain. You know, producing commodity and then exporting in a row. We need to move to the right part of the value chain, where we transform product and where also we can distribute. And I think Brazil has an important role in helping us increase the production, and essentially on food, because I don't think we will be able to master the value chain, all the value chain in Africa, in one shot. One that I think will be very important is the value chain related to what we eat. And Brazil has the capability, the knowledge, and the influence to make sure that we develop that value chain. So we'll stop here.
Thank you. Mr. Azevedo, your introductory remarks.
Very good. Thank you very much. Good morning. Thank you, João, again. I'm Portuguese. I will speak in English for obvious reasons. I will say just a few comments after my colleagues have said so many precise and concise things. One is the key word in Africa Free Trade Agreement for me is free. And free means that governments need to assume that the entrepreneurs, the companies, the individuals can run the trade. They cannot be the ones running the trade. And that's where I am maybe less optimistic. But let's see. Let's hope that is the case. The other comment I would make is it's not only trade, it's investment. It's absolutely critical to have free investment across Africa. And here I would say one more thing, which is, you know, my job is, I work at Citi, you know, the American bank, and basically I raise capital from outside the world to be invested in Africa. And when you talk to investors outside the world, you cannot talk about one or two countries in Africa. You have to tell them that the opportunity is the continent. And that's what makes people, you know, to like the idea. And they like it because of size, but they also like it because if you have several countries, your diversification is much bigger. And the reality is there's a lot of one country events in Africa. And there's a lot more today than 10 years ago when I started doing this job. So having diversification is actually very important. And with diversification comes free trade, comes free investment. So that's very, very important. One other comment I would make is, you know, it's great that an institution like Afrexim was created. I would nearly say there's nothing happening in Africa these days without Afrexim. It's such is their importance, and so it's great to see those institutions. But we have also seen private initiative doing a lot to integrate the continent. I think payments was mentioned, but if you look at payments, the multitude, the number of payment facilitators, those companies that create the rails for payment between countries in Africa, it's actually a very vibrant space. It's so vibrant that it's one of the few industries or technologies where Africa is actually leading the world. What's happening there is copied elsewhere, including here in LATAM, including Asia. And so this is a good example, and this will be my final comment here. If you allow freedom of initiative, freedom of entrepreneurship, and again, that's the free world in AFTA, Africa can deliver amazing things because the quality of the people, the quality of the companies is just unbelievable. I always say that when you talk about Africa, you have what I call the micro premium, which is the companies, the people are premium quality. But usually that premium is eaten by what I call the macro discount, which is all the issues related with governance. And it's always a fight between the micro versus the macro. In the last 10 years, I think the macro discount has beaten the micro premium, but I can see some green shoots of hope. And let's hope that this agreement is actually one other way of making that happen.
Thank you, Mr. Azevedo. I'll go back to you, Elias. Obviously, an integration process needs financing. Can you explain us what is your bank doing specifically to allow this to happen? But more specifically, what bottlenecks have you encountered and you thought, I can do something here that will enable this free trade to happen?
Yeah, no, thank you. I just wanted to draw on a point that my brother Paulo made. Because on the continent, you have 5 large economies that tend to drive everything else on the continent, regionally. So north, you've got Egypt. West, you've got Nigeria. South, you've got South Africa. And then in the middle there, you have large economies, Algeria, Tunisia, Kenya in the east. Because of that, this free trade area agreement, there will be losers and gain because of the levels of trade as we know them today. And there's been skepticism. Some of the countries came on board actually signing the agreement a bit later because they were fearful that when they open, they're going to lose more than they will gain. And that's why you need a financial backing, a bank behind that. So the African Export-Import Bank put together a fund. It's called an adjustment fund. And that fund is going to support countries that are losing, right, to draw on that fund to compensate so that we focus on the bigger picture, not the small revenues that countries are going to be losing because they are doing away with tariffs. Because the bigger objective is larger. So that's one of the initiatives the bank has put in place. But in terms of challenges, policy. I mean, he talked about the challenges of starting a new business on the continent. In terms of time, it will take years of bureaucracy going through the approval process in governments, right? Countries are actually moving in terms of enforcement and changes. Rwanda is one of them today. Seamless. In one day, a few hours, you open a business, you're gone. One-stop center. In terms of clearance of goods, movement of people, I think he made a critical point. Why should people require visas to move from one country to another? I have to get a visa to go to my brother's country in Guinea-Bissau. But as you can see, we look one, right? So if we can manage those structural challenges, free movement of people, free movement of goods and services, you don't have to deposit different bonds for one container to move from Cairo to Cape 100 and I don't know how many times. Once those infrastructure challenges have been smoothened out, there's financing at the right cost, at the right terms, then I think we should be able to see progress on this agreement. The objectives are noble. The opportunities are immense. And I think as my colleague on the extreme mentioned, it's an issue of risk appetite and it's an issue of risk perception. Today, some people think that Africa is still, one country. So if there's a case of Ebola somewhere, then, people will be hesitant to go to South Africa because that's the perception. But that perception actually is different from reality. Africa today is one of the largest place with opportunities in terms of a younger population, in terms of natural resources, arable land, etc., etc. But also, even in this day and age of climate change, renewable energy, if you look at the potential that Africa has in terms of rare earth minerals, copper, lithium, all those ingredients that will be critical for powering renewable energy are in Africa. And so those opportunities are available, and we just need to attract them. And we think the Free Trade Continental Agreement is one of those opportunities that will open up the space for investment to come on the continent.
Fantastic. Mr. Negato, we spoke a lot about borders, about visas. But there's an extra barrier, which is obviously the different rules, patterns, standards for investments. We see this in South America as well, but obviously in Africa. What is the impact that you expect this project to have in this streamlining of policies for investment, rules, and how could this be an important element in this new geography, I would say?
Right, and that's a very good point you're raising, because let me give you an example, because I like practical examples.
Absolutely.
Because we deploy capital, we look at returns, our investors making money and all that. Before we make a decision to invest in any country in Africa, there are certain criteria we look at. One is production cost if we're in manufacturing. We've invested, for example, in technology companies. We own a very large fintech in Africa. So the macro level view, as Miguel was saying, is important, but we also reduce it to its micro level. If I am competitive at the factory gate, but to get my goods out of the factory on the ship costs me twice or three times, it makes no difference for me if if my factory gate is competitive or not. So this is what we call the ease of doing business. The ease of doing business, a lot of African countries have made a lot of reforms. In fact, the World Bank used to have a ranking, which they have discontinued, but hopefully they're going to restart it again. But if you saw before the ranking was discontinued, a lot of African countries realized it was extremely important to get it right. As you said, if I can get my permit in one day, but I go out there and customs holds up my truck for a month, it wouldn't do me any good. So they have been looking at it holistically. So we've seen a lot of reforms, and it's extremely important. I got to tell you, for example, we manufacture in Ethiopia, which is the third largest economy in sub-Saharan Africa. Very large country, 128 million people. In 20 years, it'll be 180 million. So we took a big bet in Ethiopia. I'm originally from Ethiopia, so if I sound like I'm promoting Ethiopia, there's a good reason for it, but there's also a good reason. So let me give you an example. We manufacture clothing in Ethiopia for the European market. Today, our productivity in our factory in Ethiopia is 90% of our European factory. And yet, my production cost, my labor cost is a fraction of what I pay an Italian or someone in Europe, and my product ends up on the shelf the same way it does from our Italian factory. So these are practical things. But the holistic way they've approached industrialization, for example, and the way they're looking at it, at Ethiopia being a base for exporting across Africa, that's where AFCFT come in. So the ease of doing business is important. A lot of African countries, including, for example, Ethiopia, was reformed enough that it was attractive for us to put in a $50 million closing manufacturing plant in Ethiopia. So the macro is important, but the micro, the day-to-day detail. So what AFCFTA did, if you look at it, it's a huge document. You guys probably have seen it. There's a lot of compliance. You have to go through it. Do not just say, I've opened up the borders, but is it really open? Okay, is it just on paper? So if you want to attract FDI into Africa, and we have a big Brazilian audience here, and we don't see a lot of Brazilian investment in Africa, but I want to encourage them to take a look at Africa differently than they used in the past. I mean, I've lived here, so I know the strength of the Brazilian economy. For example, we work very closely with a Brazilian company called Embraer, the jet manufacturer. We invest heavily in airlines. We just set up together, we're a very large airline in Nigeria recently. We worked with airlines in Mozambique, and we've actually helped and co-invest in airlines where Embraer was the preferred vendor and they provided jets. So what I want to tell the Brazilians is Africa, from a distance, might seem like it's a difficult place, it's too far away. As Paulo said, I actually flew in yesterday directly from Africa to Sao Paulo from Addis Ababa on Ethiopian Airlines. That trade, and it was the plane was full of Brazilians. I'm not sure where they were coming from. Obviously, they were connecting via Addis. So it's a different place than you may have thought of Africa 10 years ago. João and I have talked about this in the past when we see each other at a conference. But I want to urge the Brazilians, there's a lot of synergy between Brazil's economy and Africa, and with the opening up of Africa. And let me tell you something in our wrap-up. Who's investing big time in Africa now? China. Mm-hmm. Right? And who is one of the anchor members of BRICS? China. Who's the other anchor investor in BRICS? Brazil. So if the world's second largest economy is investing not billions, tens of billions of dollars, shifting large volumes of manufacturing from China to Africa to places like Ethiopia, then I would say the Brazilians will have a lot of strength in the industrial base, in agriculture, and with Africa, as I said, going from 1.3 billion to 2 billion people in the next 30 years, I think it will be an opportunity. And we're more than happy to co-partner with Brazilian investors. We've done some, but through our private equity firm, we can work with them and facilitate and de-risk it, and also co-invest with Brazilians in manufacturing, in agriculture, and some in infrastructure, and also in the energy space as well. So this is a little pitch for the Brazilians in the audience, and those who are watching us in the broader sense, that look at Africa differently, than not just because AFCFTA is there, but a lot of African leaders we work with, we advise, are actually starting to reform their economies, making them attractive for investors, whether it's from China, was from here, or the UAE and other places, to come and invest in Africa. Increasingly urban, increasingly young, increasingly integrated. I think those will be sort of the check-off points that I would say to the Brazilians in the audience. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. Paulo, as a businessman, what concrete steps would you like to see in order for Brazil-African trade to be enhanced? And what are the specific areas do you think there's still a large possibility and opportunity for this to happen?
You need political commitment. The reason why we are more or less fan of what President Lula has done is that he has committed. And sometimes it's a sense of respect for the rest of Africa, and then we can have a dialogue, we do the business. So the political commitment for Brazil is important, and it has to be a predictable one if we really want to make a difference on that. Because there is a huge appetite to do things with Brazil. As I say, culturally, there is nothing that will stop the historical perspective. Mm-hmm. We have mixed blood, and it's going to continue. So it's up to us how we maximize that. So first, the political commitment, and we have to make sure that in administration, in Brazil, in institution, people know about Africa. And there is a mindset that needs to happen in Brazil, and the Brazil elite has to play a role on that. It's become an opportunity of competitiveness for Brazil. Africa is growing. We will never see in the history of the humanity such a huge amount of people. It's going to happen. We'll be there. And you need to feed that 1 billion and something people. That's why for me, in terms of CFTA, our focus has to be around food agribusiness, first. Secondly, Brazil has competitive advantage of some areas. We're talking about Embraer. We need aircraft. We need aircraft. Just in Angola, in the last 6 months, I've seen 2 companies that want to have access to aircraft from Embraers. And they were very specific. They want Embraer. They haven't asked for Boeing. They haven't asked for Aviland and Bombardier. It was Embraer. The issue now, how do we connect BNDES eventually with Afrexim Bank to structure funding for those planes? This will be good for Brazil because Brazil will manufacture those planes. It will create jobs in Brazil, but also for us because we need to travel. We need to travel. It's incredible the cost of traveling from an African country to another. To give you an example, to travel from Senegal to Lagos, it can cost you $1,000 in economy class. So I think there is a space, there's opportunity. Thirdly is, as I say, Embrapa, and how the technology and Brazilian companies in agro-business will go to Africa. I know you're okay. I think in terms of soja, for example, you have now displaced the US on the amount of soja you sell to China. So someone who is producing in Mato Grosso or something will be comfortable, right? Why do you bother to invest in agriculture in Africa? But I think here's the incentive that could be provided to encourage investment in Africa. I'll give you an example of a product. A country like Senegal imports something in the region of $600 million of rice every year. 600. So if you're a leader in Senegal, you'll be very, I think, concerned about the dependency you have for import coming from Asia, because most of the production of rice is coming from Asia. This is an opportunity to develop. I mentioned Senegal, which is 1.2 million tons per year, but Nigeria is almost 3 million tons per year of import of rice. And I could say the same for Angola and other countries. So I think everything related to food, everything related to mobility are 2 opportunities where I believe that the Brazilian company can make money. Now is maybe for all of us to see what the BNDES can do in partnership with the new bank in Shanghai, since you have also a Brazilian as a chairwoman. I think we have to kind of structure. It's about structuring the deals. And that should be the next step that maybe João can continue to push us to work on.
Very good. Mr. Azevedo, before we open to the floor, to the audience, there are no doubts that 2023 is a very challenging year, a lot of uncertainty. How much does that impact when you go to an investor and say, well, shall we invest? What is happening in face of all this uncertainty? And you mentioned appetite, but what are the risks in the scenario of 2023?
Yeah, very good question. I'll try to be brief. One is definitely interest rates. 10 years ago, Zambia was raising 5-year money at 5%. US is doing that today. So Zambia was raising at the same level as US is today. That gives you, we are not in a great place. And by the way, Zambia defaulted on that loan, as we all know, but they have already restructured it. It's a good story after horrific story. So that's one, and Africa and other emerging markets always suffer from that, from high interest rates in the world. Second is, yes, there is a lot of uncertainty, but that's not necessarily bad for Africa, I think, because in a sense that brings uncertainty to everywhere. The uncertainty was already in Africa because of other challenges. It's actually a good opportunity to come out with ideas, with projects that will play at the same level as everywhere else. And we are seeing that, actually. We are seeing that. People understand the opportunity. Now, it's very important to do it the proper way. And you know, I do a lot of stock equity offerings, both in the Middle East and Africa. And if I look back in the last few years, no investor has made money in buying stocks in African IPOs. The most recent one was a beautiful company called Crown Agents Bank, but it was not properly done. And the shares are 70% down 3 months later. So that killed any IPO for the next 5 years out of Africa, basically. So there's a lot of mistakes were done, but the opportunity is still there. So we just need good stories. Unfortunately, I think 10 years ago, investors were more hopeful than now, because the last 10 years have not been great. You remember 10 years ago, Naira was trading at 165 to the dollar. It's now trading at 1,000. So, you know, there's a lot of opportunities, but a lot of things need to change. And again, I focus on governments. I think it's mainly on the government side, because when you go to the individuals, to the companies, what's happening there is just amazing. One final comment on financing for Africa. You know, the opportunities are so big that you can have China, you can have Brazil, you can have the global capital markets chipping in and financing investment in Africa. China played a very important role over the last 10 years. It was mismanaged. A lot of people thought they didn't need to pay back to China. They are now realizing that they actually need to pay back. And that financing was actually very expensive. And right now, in many countries in Africa, you see FX rates ballooning just because they had to pay the money to China, which, you know, China is fair. I mean, they need to be paid back. That's fair. So again, governance is critical, but the opportunity is there. And I think we can have a few examples of good stories. Let's hope that we can build on that.
Fantastic. Thank you. Let's see if we have any questions from the audience. If you have any questions to any of the four gentlemen here, not to me, obviously, please, the floor is yours. Here, the gentleman on my right, if there's a microphone that could reach him. Just 1 second, sir.
Sorry, thank you so much. First of all, let me appreciate once again Professor Joe for always calling us for this important event every year. And I'm happy to participate for this second time. Of course, I've got COVID. So thank you once again to all the organizers and all those present. My only question is to my friend there who has been talking about the risks and uncertainty associated with trade and investment in Africa. And that is, and I have not heard him mention anything about the current developments across the globe. The war in Ukraine, the developments in the Middle East, things that are coming out there. And he has talked well about the cost of doing business which is, of course, everybody knows about, and the deficiency of some infrastructure in some key areas. But then there are potentials that I think we totally ignored. The issue of energy, which is very critical across, has not been given its due importance. And I remember the Guinea-Bissau businessman has been talking about those other bigger pictures of bigger potentials in attracting investments in solar, in other forms of energy, in order to drive some of these productive value chains that will enhance Africa's effectiveness and capacity across. I think some of these issues need to be threshed further. I don't know how you look at it, but that's just one of the things I think we should talk about. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Azevedo. I think it's okay.
Good. Thank you. Thank you for the question. All very valid points, right? But all those points are outside control of African governments and African companies. So there's not much point on trying to deal with that. Those are there. But those are there to everyone. What I think is there's so much that can be done within Africa to make investment more attractive, that if you focus on that, that will be enough, because the proposition then will be so compelling that people will come. And I remember, I remember Nigeria in the Obasanjo days and in the beginning of Good Luck days. People were flying into Nigeria to invest there. Then things didn't go quite as planned, and now people can't even fly into Nigeria because the airlines are not flying into Nigeria because they cannot get the money out of Nigeria. So, yes, there's a lot of risks, but more risks in the world are not good, but Africa can do a lot to be more attractive. And as I said, is once again, has a lot more to do with governments than anything else. And even energy, right? Some countries should benefit from high oil prices. No, countries like Nigeria and Angola, they should not have FX problems now when the oil prices are $80 to $90, but they still have. So there's something that is not really working out very well there.
I think on energy, an important point to be, I think, clear for the rest of the world. I've been quite involved in climate change issue. I was part of the team who worked on setting up the Green Climate Fund. But this narrative that trying to get Africa out of energy and fossil fuel, I think it has to be clear that it's not going to happen. I think Africa needs to transition to cleaner energy. But if we have access to gas, in order to be more competitive for building things, for manufacturing things, we will do it. Unfortunately, it becomes very difficult for African countries to have access to financing, even for gas. I think it took us quite several COPs for people to agree that Africa needs to use gas. And I hope that in Dubai next month, people will understand clearly that Africa will be part of the process of transition for mixed energy, but Africa will not turn its back to its potential, and essentially in gas, if this can enhance our productivity. And I believe that needs to be clear. Because for Africa, the CFTA, the Continental Free Trade Agreement, is also a national security issue. We cannot be in a position where you have millions of youth asking for a job. If I'm an African president today, a leader, I will not sleep because of that nightmare of the amount of young people who are coming to the market for job and are not finding jobs. So it's a priority. So I think it's an issue for us, apart from the risk that Miguel was talking about, is for us to be consistent in terms of our narrative. The Africa of today is not the Africa of tomorrow, yesterday, with the generation of people who don't know what they talk about. Africa is globalized. We have a clear sense of our interest and the partners with which we want to accelerate our development. And Brazil is an important partner. I think, João, you need to do a better job with the leadership here in Brazil, that the partnership is there. Obviously, China is important, and Miguel has been frank. We made some mistake with China, and we have learned our lesson. And I think China is also learning that we need the next time to build a much more smarter partnership. The amount of money we got for infrastructure was quite expensive, but we needed it. Today, to find money for infrastructure is difficult, so China was well placed. So that's why we went to that wedding. But it's an expensive wedding, but we are making correction. But I think the smart partnership with Brazil is very important because, again, for us, it relates to food, and then if we master our value chain on agribusiness, it will create jobs, it will employ more people, and I think that's the real sovereignty is built. Because if you are not able to feed your population, you are not talking about independence.
Something on
Very short so we can open.
Yeah,
Please.
on the, you know, we operate in Nigeria, we operate in Angola, so we understand a bit closer some of the challenges. So when you talk about the FX challenges on the continent, you cannot overlook the structure of the trade itself. As Paulo said, if the trade on the African continent is wired towards exporting raw materials and importing fixed goods, finished goods, using scarce FX, right? You're going to struggle with foreign currency earnings and FDIs and reserves. Take the case of Nigeria. If you look at Nigeria over the last 10 years, right from the commodity price shock, 2016, 2017, when oil prices tanked, all the way to COVID-19, now to Russia, Ukraine, and their concentration, reliance on oil. You know, you have to deal with those issues. Diversification is what the AfCFTA is trying to do. How can we leverage on our competitive advantages to be able to allocate resources where we need them? Because as long as we are still linked to exporting raw commodities and importing finished products using the dollar and heavily concentrated, we're going to have these challenges. So that's why we as Africans need to tell our story differently. And that story is not to say, rely on your natural resources in terms of exporting them. No. That story should be, how do we diversify? How do we localize? How do we manufacture on the continent to be able to withstand those external shocks as we saw them?
Excellent. Do we have another question from the audience? Yes, sir.
Thank you. My name is Alain Thierry Mbonge. I'm from Afreximbank. It's not a question. It's actually to inform all the African trading partners, all the Brazilian investors that Afreximbank is here, and we would like to have meetings with anyone that has faced any challenge in Africa doing business, any project finance. We provide the full array of solutions in terms of financing and non-financial solutions. So please, let's take this opportunity to make concrete actions and get the best out of this forum. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I think there's a question in the middle, and then we're going to get another question there, and then unfortunately we'll have to close.
Thank you so much. My name is Johannes from Ethiopian Embassy in Brazil. Just I want to make some correction regarding the Ethiopian Airlines flights from Guinea-Bissau panelists mentioned a lot. And about visa issuance. Just first, the Ethiopian Airlines, as you understand, that the long-standing history. It's more than 77 years, and it is a whole old history airlines, which means it's authenticated airlines. Really, I appreciate that, and the airlines. Flights from Addis Ababa to Sao Paulo is not 2 or 3 days in a week. 7 days a week flies to Sao Paulo, or all weeks. And not only Sao Paulo, it is flies to also Buenos Aires, Argentina, 7 days a week. And I think it is very important for trade hub and the investment hub Africa to Latin America. The second issue is regarding visa issues. As you understand that Ethiopia has granted visa on arrival without visa issuance for diplomatic and official passport holders. The same too from other countries also, what we signed agreement of visa waiver, including the Brazil. And nowadays, Brazil and Ethiopians for official passports and visa passports, no visa issuance, no visa requests. And all Africans also, when go to Addis Ababa, visit Addis Ababa without visa. And that is also support and helping for without border trade and investment. The other issue raised by Guinea-Bissau, of course, independence and liberty is very important. Still, Africa has faced different challenges, including the security issues. That is also one of the long time colonization problems. But now, of course, we are at a good line. We working together with other worlds. Nowadays, the Africans and Brazil relations also, it is very good relations to support each other and for mutual benefits. Finally, I want to some questions. Of course, I didn't hear from the one of the challenges.
Yes.
Yeah, one of the challenges of the African or world problems currently, or global world. And what about the challenges nowadays in Africa as well as in the global level? Thank you so much.
Thank you. And the last question, sir, if you could be very brief. We have 3 minutes to put the question and to answer. So it will be a big challenge.
Thank you. I'll make it very easy. I'll provide the answer and not the question. So just a comment. My name is Yemi Akimba-Mijo, the immediate past executive director of the Forum for Agricultural Research in Africa. 10 years ago, I came to Brazil. I went to Embrapa to ask a question. How is Brazil winning and Africa is not? And this, for me, is extremely crucial. And this is why I keep coming to this forum, to find out how can Africa leverage on the power that Brazil has. Now, I understood 10 years ago that it took Brazil 50 years, and I learned this from Embrapa, to move out of poverty, to move out of dependence on food imports, to become a key player in feeding the world. How did Brazil do it and Africa is failing to do it? And I think that one of the things we need to take out of the Brazil-Africa Forum, this is my 5th or 6th time, I'm still looking for what I can take home. I think that we have a blueprint of a successful country that transitioned out of poverty into prosperity. but why is it so difficult for Africa to copy that blueprint? And I think if Jean Bosco will help us in Brazil Africa Institute to master or handhold Africa in that narrative to walk Africa out. How is it that Brazil is now manufacturing aircraft in Embraer? Why is it that Brazil is a key exporter when it comes to agriculture? And Africa has all the good numbers, but we are still more hungry than we were 10 years ago. So that for me is a crucial thing, and that's something I think we should be talking about. I'll close by this one phrase I learned 35 years ago when I was graduating from graduate school. It says, in theory and practice is the same. In practice, theory and practice, not the same. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. I invite the four of you to give a last word, trying to answer to some of these questions that were put, and then we're going to wrap up.
All right, thank you. I want to make sure that the tone here is clear. There are no risks in Africa that we haven't seen anywhere else. There are solutions for everything. As someone who deploys capital across Africa, I can tell you, whether it's in Nigeria, where we are just putting in 250 million, it's one of the most amazing countries in the world. Yes, there are some challenges, but nothing that's not insurmountable. So for the Brazilian, my audience today is the Brazilians, right? What I'm just telling you is when you look at your core competency and you feel like there's synergy between what you do and what is available in Africa, disregard, I don't want to say disregard, but discount the enormous perception risks that you hear about Africa. As I said, as someone who's looking and calculating IRRs every day for global investors, there's nothing we have not seen anywhere else in the world that you will see in Africa. So do your own due diligence, partner with locals, build capacity locally, and your returns in Africa will be very attractive, okay? Secondly, when we look at the macro global level, we see what's called a gradual shift of economic power from west to east. We've some studies that was done by investment banks like Miguel's and others. Over the next 25 to 30 years, the share of global GDP outside of the United States and Western Europe is going to be significantly bigger than it is today. Of course, led by China, the Asians growing, but more and more the growth of Africa. So if you position yourselves to come in at the early stages where Africa is today, and you know how to manage risk, you have local partners who know what they're doing, and you have a long-term view of your investments in Africa. I'm talking about investments here. Trade is a little different. Then you will do very well. Don't come to Africa to flip assets overnight. It's not the United States. It's not a developed economy like Europe. If you are patient, we raise patient capital. But our returns for that will be higher than what you would get in most other countries. So my suggestion is the gradual shift of economic power is unmistakable. It's going from east to west. In fact, now it's called the South-South with the likes of BRICS. If you saw the proportion of the BRICS GDP to the G7, it's already bigger on a PPP basis. But even on a nominal basis over the next 3 to 4 years, the BRICS alone will have an aggregate GDP that's bigger than the West. So if you're looking for growth, if you're looking for dynamic, linear growth over the next 25, 30, 40 years, in my view, Africa is the place to be. But you just have to know how to manage risks. Thank you.
Thank you. Elias.
I think we need to continue searching for answers, I think, to the problems my brother highlighted. How do we do this? The African Export-Import Bank has organized its 3rd edition of the Intra-African Trade Fair. It's going to be taking place in Cairo, in Egypt. We have over 1,600 exhibitors already registered across 75 countries, so it's a global event. Over 35,000 participants. It's an opportunity to have conversation. It's the trading place on the continent every year. And I would like to invite all of you. Our team is here If anybody needs further information, we're happy to provide that. So we continue with the conversation on how do we trade with one another? How do we, develop, each other's potential? I think as I close for me, Africa does not need aid. Africa no longer needs grant. Africa no longer needs to be pitied. I think we are past that stage. Africa needs to trade with its partners on a mutually viable basis. The opportunities are there. The returns are actually high. The risk is manageable. What you see is perception. But these risks, as he said, are not anywhere else we haven't seen. They are all over the place. They are global. It's a matter of understanding the quantum of risk you're taking and demanding an appropriate return. And I think that's what we are emphasizing as a continent, that we are open for opportunities for business and not so much on grant and aid as has been the case historically. Thank you very much.
Fantastic, thank you. Paulo, final words?
I think we have said it all, so thank you again.
Thank you. Mr. Azevedo?
Yes, so one very last word.
Can you, yes.
Hello? Yeah. One very last word. The opportunities are immense. As always, there are risks, as we have discussed here. But if you go along with the people that know the continent, and as I said in my first comment, Afrexim is clearly the leading bank. There are other regional banks, but the opportunity is there, and go for it. If Africa is the continent where an improvement in productivity will have a bigger impact in the world. So it's in everybody's interest, and the opportunity is definitely there.
Fantastic. I think a key word here, so we can conclude, was the fact that we needed to tell a new story, especially here in